Secretary Armitage has a long and very distinguished record of service to our nation.
Very much, Admiral Waringa. Thank you for having me here. Of course I'd be here today. I wouldn't miss it for the world. In addition to acknowledging the fine Ross family here, and of course our foreign friends from friendly and allied nations, I want to also note three people who have been big in Ed's life, professional life: Link Bloomfield, my former colleague; Kurt Campbell, a friend and colleague; and Carl Ford, who have come in, as well as Randy Shriver and Cara Bew, who work closely with Ed in different capacities. You know, Ed and I have done this before. If you look carefully in your brochure, you'll see a much younger family, a much younger Ed Ross, and a much younger Rich Armitage. We tried to retire him before, and the vaccination didn't keep. Actually, it wasn't really retirement. It was an award ceremony in lieu of a retirement. He was medically retired. But I want to talk a little bit about Ed's career, and then I want to talk a little bit about the choices he made, and then I want to talk a little bit about him and you, all of you who are here today. First of all, Ed didn't do it the easy way. You go from Quincy, Illinois to 2 combat tours in Vietnam, one with mobile riverine forces as a forward air controller, forward artillery spotter controller, secondly in Nha Trang and Pleiku as the head of a military intelligence detachment, recipient of the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry with Star. These are things that Ed doesn't talk about. People don't know it. You have to read it in a bio to really know it. But he saw the angry iron. He didn't do it easy. He did it the hard way. And then he continued to do it the hard way as Assistant Army Attaché in Beijing. And if you think it was easy in those days in Beijing, that was not the Beijing of now. That was a much more difficult and neuralgic time. Living was harder. Surveillance was omnipresent. You had no privacy. This is a tough, tough job. And then, continuing with the tough part of his life, the Lord had something in store for Ed. He threw him a real high, hard one, if you're a baseball fan, in terms of a life-threatening disease. And of course, Ed faced that with the same courage and skill and decorum, and of course, with the love and support of a family. Stared it in the eye and beat it. And then he came with me, and we worked together. This was back when dinosaurs roamed the earth, when Bob Young and others were in ISA. It was a different time. Country directors had an unbelievable amount of power. And as far as I know, they used it wisely and well. At least they didn't tell me if they didn't. And we served, and I was thinking Ed has served with Secretary Weinberger and Secretary Carlucci. And he served with Secretary Aspen. He served with Secretary Perry, Secretary Cohen, Secretary Rumsfeld, and of course now with the man who I think is the pick of the litter, Secretary Gates. Just think about the number or the history that Ed has seen. But you know, whenever he came to a fork in the road, he took it. But there was some consistency to that fork in the road. He goes to become the Deputy Assistant Secretary of POW, MIA Affairs, and at the time he took it, there was no more single neuralgic issue that confronted that government. Is that right, Carl? You remember it? Where Ed constantly reminded us of our duty to those who've gone before us, to our debt to those who serve us now, and our down payment to those who serve in the future, that their nation will never forget. To find out what happened to them, their ultimate fates. And boy, if you didn't have a tough hide before that job, Ed, you sure got one after it. And then on to DCSA, or as I still refer to it, DSAA, with apologies, Admiral. And it occurred to me that what Ed has shown us in this 42-and-a-half-year career is that the bard was wrong. Shakespeare would tell you in Macbeth that life is full of storm and fury, signifying nothing. Ed Ross, by his behavior and by his career choices and by taking those forks in the road that he took, shows us that he wanted to live a life of significance. 42-and-a-half years of choices demonstrating a life of significance. Now, I want to tell you a story, Ed, because you were obviously in government service at this time, and I think I wanted to share it with you and with all of you. It concerns me initially, but it concerns all of you who have served either in uniform or as a civilian, this great government of ours. I want to take you back to 1991, right after the Gulf War. You remember there was a great adulation in the American public for the servicemen and women who participated in that grand battle, in that grand war. Part of it, I think, was a reflection of sort of a desire on part of the American public to acknowledge the service of those who had served in Vietnam and didn't have quite such a homecoming. I think it was also a reflection of the relief the American public felt that our casualties were so relatively low and the objectives so relatively swiftly achieved. But no matter, there were a whole host of reasons. There was a lot of adulation for U.S. military forces, and in my view, richly deserved. There was a fellow for the Washington Post at that time who used to write opinion pieces occasionally, and he took a bit of umbrage at all this adulation. And he wrote a piece in the Washington Post one day, and he questioned why the American public was spending all this time and all this energy saluting those who'd served. And he took a particular aim at someone we both worked with, Ed. That's General Powell. He wanted to know why the American public chose to honor Powell in such a way. After all, he said, Powell's only a soldier. Well, I was quite inflamed at this op-ed piece, and I wrote a very injudicious letter to the editors of the Washington Post, and one which they printed after some judicious deletions, for which I thank them. And several days after my letter appeared in the Post, on a weekend, I got a knock on my door, and I opened it, and there was a fellow there who, quite elderly, dressed in a black suit with a hat, and he had a sort of a white Van Dyke beard. And he said, "Mr. Armitage." I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, I'm your neighbor. I'm Kenton Kilmer." He said, "I've been an educator in Virginia for almost 70-odd years. I live up the street. May I come in?" And I asked him in. He said, "You know, after I made him comfortable, he said, I couldn't help but notice your letter to the editor of the Washington Post the other day. And he said, I wanted to bring you something." And he handed me a book. He said, "I thought you'd find interesting what my father had to say about the possibility of virtue in service." And I'm sitting there, not putting two and two together, and chatting with him a little bit. I accepted the book, and we chatted a while, and he stood up and left. And I hadn't really paid attention to the name Kenton Kilmer. But when I looked at the cover of the book, it was called Memories of My Father, Joyce Kilmer, by Kenton Kilmer. Well, so I opened it up, and there was a note that said, based on your comments in the Washington Post, please see page such and such to see what my father said about the possibility of virtue in service. But before I did that, I looked at the forward, and here's the story of Joyce Kilmer. Joyce Kilmer lived in New Jersey. We had a brand new wife and a young son named Kenton. He was so inflamed by the sinking of the Lusitania in 1916 that he vowed that if our president ever put us into the great conflict, that he would volunteer to serve. And in 1918, when President Wilson did this, he was good to his word. And he volunteered to serve. And he found himself in Fighting Fathers Duffy's division, the 69th, and it was a New Jersey-New York division. Further, he found himself on the battlefields of France, and it was his custom to write back to his family scenes of French countryside and scenes of bivouac life, etc. And his family moved from New Jersey to Virginia, and one day a poem arrived with a letter to Joyce Kilmer's wife and a letter to their son. And it was almost contemporaneous with the announcement by the Department of War that Sergeant Joyce Kilmer had died of wounds on the battlefield of France. He's interred there still today. So here's what Joyce Kilmer, Ed, said about the possibility of virtue in service, and moreover, in my words, living a life of significance. It's called The Peacemaker. Upon his will he binds a radiant chain. For freedom's sake he is no longer free. It is his task, the slave of liberty, with his own blood to wipe away a stain. That pain may cease, he yields his flesh to pain, To banish war, he must a warrior be. He dwells in night, eternal dawn to see, and gladly dies, abundant life to gain. What matters death if freedom be not dead? No flags are fair if freedom's flag be furled. Who fights for freedom goes with joyful tread to meet the fires of hell against him hurled, and has for captain him whose thorn-wreathed head smiles from the cross upon a conquered world. Ed, Ross family, thank you for 42 and a half years of exquisite service to our nation. Thank you.
Secretary Armitage will now present Mr. Ross with a letter of congratulations from the Commander-in-Chief. Dear Edward, congratulations on your retirement from the Department of Defense after 43 years of federal service. Our nation is deeply indebted to the men and women who have devoted their lives to public service. I know how proud your family and colleagues must be of your many accomplishments. Laura and I send our best wishes for many happy years. Sincerely, George W. Bush.